All right, to the money desk now, and we've got Devon with us in studio. So, Devon, quite a big day in terms of Glencore and the fact that a UK court is making a decision on the fact that they're accused of bribery across the continent.
Yeah, the ruling today is about a fine that's going to be meted down, and we believe that that ruling had taken place. Here's the background. Glencore faces that ruling on bribery allegations in a London court today. Now, during sentencing this week, we heard how employees and agents of the company used private jets to transfer cash to pay bribes to oil officials in West Africa. That's just part of what prosecutors told the court yesterday. Olly Barret is in London. He has been following that story. Olly, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. So we are told that news just coming in that the ruling on that fine has been made by the court to the scandal hit Glencore. What's the latest coming out of that?
That's right. We're getting early details now of what the court has decided, and a confiscation order has been approved at Southwark Crown Court of £93.5 million. That's $105.29 million against the British subsidiary of Glencore for those 7 bribery offences, which, as you say, were all in relations to oil operations in its African units. Now, the judge, Peter Fraser, has approved this confiscation order against Glencore Energy UK Limited. As I say, £93.5 million. Now, we wait to get further detail of any comments that the judge has made in this sentencing, and whether there is indeed any more to come with that, but that would represent significant fines for Glencore, effectively over those operations in Africa. As you were saying, these are offences that Glencore had previously pleaded guilty to, but on Wednesday we had the sentencing hearing in which some of the final arguments essentially were made about exactly what had taken place. This relates to bribery and corruption in Nigeria, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, South Sudan, Equatorial Guinea, bribes worth around $27 million in total. But the court process had heard of the so-called harm caused by this corruption and bribery, and that was valued to have run to around $128 million. Now, the way that the system is set up here in the UK with relations to proceedings like this, it was expected that therefore around 3 times that so-called harm could have been levelled against Glencore in fines, so potentially up around $300 million. Clearly that confiscation order that has now come in from the court is significantly below that. But as I say, we wait to hear whether more detail is coming from the judge in exactly the decision-making process and the confiscation order that he has come to. At the hearing yesterday, the chairperson of Glencore was there. We heard from a Glencore lawyer saying that there had been a change in culture at the company, recognising that the conduct was inexcusable. But there were some fairly extraordinary stories heard in court yesterday about exactly how some of this money was flying around parts of Africa in private jets, for example, in cash, so that local officials could be bribed and so that Glencore could get access to things like preferential rates when it came to oil cargoes.
It really is extraordinary, isn't it, Olly? I mean, some of those bribery charges, as you say, Glencore already admitting guilt earlier this year. But, you know, the court heard the extent to which some of the officials and executives went to bribe African countries. As I said, quite extraordinary. And you mentioned here you have $105 million, and you measure that against this word that they use, so-called harm of the bribes that took place. And I'm just wondering, you know, there's still more to come, but does that measure up as a penalty strong enough to that harm?
Yeah, certainly we await a little bit more detail on how the judge has reached this decision. One bit of context to bear in mind is that, of course, just months ago, Glencore actually pleaded guilty to similar but separate offences in front of United States officials. That led to fines worth over $1 billion. So in the context of all of this, you're actually looking now well over $1 billion in fines for Glencore for this type of activity. The UK and US authorities were actually coordinating in their investigations, making sure that they weren't, for example, pursuing exactly the same cases so that they could separate some of it out and make sure they had as many bases covered as possible. So the wider context is that Glencore is on the hook for a huge amount of money overall, but there will certainly be scrutiny of the decision-making process here in London and that amount of money and whether indeed it is appropriate given the scale of the wrongdoing in Africa. I mean, we were hearing again in court yesterday, South Sudan, for example, a plane arriving shortly after independence in 2011 with $800,000 on board, and shortly after that we're told that Glencore's activities suddenly, their fortunes turned for the better soon after that plane arrived. But similar stories in those other African locations as well. And so there's going to be ongoing scrutiny of Glencore, but also individuals at Glencore, and that is one of the key elements of this case as well. A lot of individuals wrapped up in some of these accusations were not named in these court proceedings, and that's because the Serious Fraud Office here in the UK is considering now whether it can go ahead and press charges against individuals, not just against the British subsidiary of Glencore, but against some of those executives and traders involved in some of this corruption and bribery.
Of course, here in South Africa, our interest in this court case would be the fact that there's already controversy with Glencore and the so-called Optimum mine. Now, as far as the parliamentary position is concerned, we heard calls for an investigation because of potential criminal activities, nothing further than that. But this ruling in some ways, Olly, as I understand it, is a first in many ways because we've not had a corporate conviction under that UK Bribery Act before, have we?
This is the first time, exactly right, and that's part of the reason that those potential proceedings against individuals are so interesting to watch, because that would also be a first. I think what we are hearing is that there may well be further fines coming against Glencore from Southwark Crown Court today, that this confiscation amount could indeed be separate to a fine amount. So again, we're still waiting for quite a lot of detail coming from Southwark Crown Court, and indeed whether that number that we were talking about at the top is actually going to rise significantly when fines are added to this confiscation order. It might be that the confiscation order represents the punishment part in terms of reparations for Glencore. As I say, much more detail to come on this, and I think the SFO here in the UK, having effectively pursued a successful prosecution against the British subsidiary of Glencore, in the sense that Glencore eventually pleaded guilty to it, it will feel empowered, I'm sure, to pursue similar investigations against some other companies around the world accused of similar things, particularly with regards to African operations.